learn about seed starting. I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Melissa Almendinger. I am the garden coordinator for the community garden at Duke Farms. Our community garden is 10 years old now. It's 5 acres, allotment style, which means that everyone rents their own individual garden plot. And I'm told that it's the largest of that style garden in the country. So it's a lot of people. We have nearly 500 people participating. Usually at this point, I ask how many of you guys are gardeners, but I can't ask that at this point. I've never taught this way before without interacting with my audience. So I will do the best that I can. I wanted to give you a little bit of sort of logistics about this type of teaching. I have never, like I said, never taught this way before. And I will do the best that I can. And I hope that we get through this and you find it successful. The first thing that I'll say is you guys are all muted and your video is turned off at this point. So please do not unmute yourself or turn your video back on because it kind of plays with the screen a little bit and it slows down your internet connection. What you want to do in the top right corner of your screen, there should be a button that says speaker view or gallery view. You want to keep it on speaker view. Otherwise, you're going to see 100 teeny tiny little faces that are registered for this program instead of me, which I don't necessarily need you to see me, but I think it's a little bit distracting to see all the other people. There is an option to ask questions during the program. We ask that you do not use the raise hand button. Some of you have that. Use the chat. So if you hover sort of at the bottom of the screen, there should be a little bubble that says chat. You can go into the chat room, type your questions. I have an assistant, Kathy, with me today who's going to be monitoring the questions. If she needs to, she can interrupt me and ask me to clarify something. Or when we get to the end of the program, we'll cover some of those questions. And any questions that we run out of time for, we can save that chat and then I can type the answers, email everybody who's registered today answers to those questions as well as the PDF that I'm going to be using today for the program. So you will get all the answers that you need in a timely fashion. Let's see. If you, I shouldn't have to say, but any inappropriate behavior, we can remove you from the program so that hopefully there's not anything like that going on. So how it's going to work today is we're going to, once I am done here with this little introduction, I'm going to share my screen with you, which is a PDF of vegetable seed starting. It's a class I've taught lots of times in person. These programs right at Duke Farms. And so I modified it a little bit for today to shorten it up. And I will go through that presentation. Then I will actually move to my seed starting area in my house. And I will do a quick demo for you of starting some seeds and then of transplanting some plants that have already been growing in my house for about a month. And then once that's done, I will see if I can go through some of those questions if we have time and answer those. And we hope to be wrapped up here by 11 o'clock. I know that these type of educational programs can drag on if they go much longer than an hour. So that's kind of the way that it'll work today. So welcome again to those of you that have joined. I see the numbers keep rising, so I'm so happy to have you guys with me here today. As I said before, my name is Melissa Almendinger. I work at Duke Farms as the coordinator of our community garden. I wanted to wish everybody a happy Earth Day. More importantly, perhaps a happy 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Duke Farms was actually planning a whole plethora of programs to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Unfortunately, a lot of those programs have been cut, but we hope that you in your own homes and backyards for today or any other day are celebrating Earth Day and doing all sorts of great things for our planet. Some of the inspiration behind this program, obviously I do lots of gardening programs. I teach about 50 programs a year at Duke Farms. Hopefully we'll get back there very soon and you guys can come in person to some of those programs. In the meantime, I'm going to be scheduling more of these online style programs. So once you get the PDF, there'll be like a little survey and it will ask if you have suggestions for other types of gardening programs. I'd love to hear your feedback to see what you guys want to learn about. It seems that there is a large interest in gardening in this current culture where suddenly we're thinking more about where our food comes from. We're thinking about food security. We maybe just don't want to go to the grocery store. And so people are revisiting the idea of backyard gardens, which I love. I think everybody should have a garden. I think, you know, the ability to plant your own food and grow your own food, even in small quantities, is empowering and fun and educational, and it's great exercise and all of those wonderful things. It might become a bit of an addiction, as it has for me and many of my gardeners, but I always say to my husband, there's worse things for me to be addicted to besides playing out in my backyard in the dirt. So, you know, just as victory gardening was a thing back in World War II, where people were wanting to preserve food and grow food, and I think something like 40% of the nation's fresh produce was grown in backyards. I don't know that we'll get back to that number again, but I love the idea of people being inspired and thinking more about growing their own food. So I will turn it over to my share screen. So let me do that, and then we can get started right away. Okay, so now that we're in, my screen is shared. I hope that you're all seeing veggie seed starting. Kathy can chime in if in fact there's a problem, or you guys can go into the chat and let her know if there's any problem along the way. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna stop my video. You shouldn't see any little people hovering in the corner of your screen. If you do, there is a button near the top left of the little thumbnails that says hide thumbnail view. And if you do that, then you'll see the whole PowerPoint that you should be seeing. So with that, we'll go ahead and get going. So this is vegetable seed starting. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so the first thing I like to think about is why you might want to start your own seeds. Obviously, you could start a garden without planting your own seeds, and that is a great option, and I don't want to deter people or make them feel bad if they go to a garden center and buy their own tomato plants or buy some, you know, herbs and things like that. If you start your own seeds, there is a little bit more variety available to you. So for instance, sometimes when I go to the garden center, I see tomatoes that are called slicing tomatoes. We don't know what variety that is. And if you look in a catalog that sells seeds, or even if you go to the garden center and check your rack, you'll see hundreds of varieties of slicing tomatoes. So you have more of an option to choose. Maybe you want purple slicing tomatoes, or maybe you want teeny tiny yellow grape tomatoes. Maybe you want purple potatoes instead of different, you know, regular potatoes from your grocery store. So starting your own seeds and growing your own vegetables is a great way to increase the variety that's available to you. You have a little bit more control. You have more control over what time the plant is available. So again, especially right now where we're kind of stuck in our houses and maybe not wanting to go to the nursery at several different times, you know, when it's time to plant your lettuce, and then again when it's time to plant peppers, you have more control over when your vegetable starts are ready to go into the ground. And they're usually a little bit more healthy because you've been tending to them yourself. Another benefit is knowing exactly what's in the soil. So I am an organic gardener. Our community garden is all organic. So we recommend using organic potting soil to start up your veggie starts. You have no control over that, especially if you go someplace like Lowe's. It's almost guaranteed that it's non-organic soil. It's not necessarily a problem. You can still put those plants into your organic garden, but you do have more control if you start it yourself. You can grow extras, and my gardeners love to do this because, you know, it's just as easy to start 20 tomato plants as it is to start 3. But of course, then you have tons left over. So you can share with your friends, you can swap different varieties, and that's always a really fun thing to do. Seeds are a tremendously less expensive than transplant. You can buy a 4-pack of tomato plants from the garden center for probably $3 or $4, and you can buy a pack of tomato seeds for the same price or less, and you're gonna get maybe 20 to 50 seeds depending on the variety. So, and those seeds can last year after year. I've planted tomato seeds that are from a pack that's, 5 or 6 years old. So you're going to save a lot of money. I say that because I always say that with gardening. In reality, you're not saving any money. You're gonna get addicted like I am and buy 10 different varieties of tomatoes. But it's all for the greater good. But in general, the price per plant is less expensive when starting from seed. And then we're going to talk a lot about number 6 because some vegetables out in the garden can only be started directly by seed. It's really not recommended to buy them as a transplant. And you probably won't even see them in the garden center. So things like carrots or radishes really cannot be grown. You can't buy them in a little 6-pack and transplant them into your garden because they just don't do well as transplants. So you're opening up this large assortment of vegetables that are available to you by starting your own seeds. It's really important to understand where we are in the country when growing a garden, whether you're starting from seed or not. You need to know when to be able to place the plants outside into the garden. So it's really important. Right now it's April 22nd. Our last approximate frost date in our region, which is zone 6B here in Somerset County, the last frost date is approximately May 15th. And we did have a frost just last night. Oftentimes the frosts are done by early May. But there is a chance. We have had slight frost here in the past couple of years, just like May 14th. And if you have stuff like basil planted outside, it's going to for sure die. Now, if you started your own seeds and poured all this time and love into growing this basil plant and it dies, that's really unfortunate. So keep that date in mind. That May 15th date is really critical. And we're going to talk a lot more about it as I go through this program. All right, so how do seeds grow? When you plant a seed in the soil, either whether it's in a little pack of, to start your own seed indoors, or you're planting the seed directly outside, the seed needs basically 3 things to germinate, which is moisture, temperature, and oxygen, and to some degree light, but not all seeds need light to germinate. Most of them actually do not. So this is why, a lot of young elementary school children can do this experiment where they germinate like a lima bean usually on their kitchen counter. They put it in a little Ziploc bag with some warm water and a paper towel. So that's giving them a little bit of warmth and definitely some moisture. It wouldn't germinate necessarily in, fully soggy conditions. It would probably rot. So it does need some oxygen in order to prevent it from rotting. Some things, lettuce comes to mind, that prefers to germinate in the light, but most things, again, you don't need light to germinate. It's important to know that seeds do not need fertilizer to germinate. So if you look at this little tiny seed all the way on the left, it looks like a bean seed. The fleshy coating that makes up most of that seed is actually food for the baby plant. So the little root emerges, and that the 2 kind of fleshy parts of the seed will absorb into the plant and give it enough energy to produce its first set of leaves, which are called cotyledons, as well as the roots. So you can see the cotyledons are the first ones that kind of come out. That second set of leaves that come out, that's when the plant actually is starting to produce its own food and needs some nutrition in the soil. So that becomes important because the question of whether to fertilize your seedlings comes up. You do not actually need to fertilize the soil that you plant your seeds in because they don't need it yet. But once your plants get those first set of true leaves, that second larger set, not the cotyledons, that's when they can benefit from some fertility. And I'll give you some recommendations on what I use to fertilize my little baby veggie plants. One more thing I wanted to mention as far as temperature and oxygen in the soil. We've had an unseasonably cool April and wet. So it's been like in the 40s most days and raining. The soil is then thereby very chilly and very wet. So if you were to plant a seed out there right now, chances are it would rot before it would germinate because it is so cold and wet. And seeds do need a particular temperature to germinate. Most of them like the soil to be at least 50 degrees. If you're not sure and you have a thermometer in your house, I usually use a meat thermometer, one of those digital ones. You can actually poke it right into your garden soil and read the temperature. If it's under 50 degrees, I would hold off and not plant any seeds. A lot of gardeners get very anxious at this time of year and want to put everything in there, but you really are not gaining any time in your garden. I've done experiments where I planted peas, several weeks apart, and they will produce at the same time, basically, because it takes so long for seeds to get started when it's cold and wet. So some of the supplies that you're gonna need in order to start your own seeds indoors. So of course, a place to make a mess, whether that's your garage. If it's not too cold, you can do it right outside. You obviously need some seeds. If you're an organic gardener, you don't necessarily need organic seeds, but it is an option. You need some seed starting mix. You cannot go into your garden and just dig up some soil. Number one, because the garden soil outside is usually much too heavy. You're gonna bring it inside and it's gonna compact in those little tiny pots. Also, there may be funguses and other living creatures that are gonna start to hatch out in your warm house, and you don't want that to happen. So go and buy yourself a quality bag of either potting soil, seed starting mix, germinating mix. You can use any of those, but definitely a bag that you purchase from the garden center. And usually the more expensive ones are a little bit more high quality. Again, it does not need to have fertility in it, but some of them do, and that may help once your seeds start to move along in their growth process. You need some kind of tray to put your seeds into. You'll see on the bottom right picture of a tray that you can purchase. You can also upcycle anything in your house, yogurt containers, solo cups I've heard people use, clamshells that are left over from, strawberries and things like that you buy from the supermarket. You can experiment and use all different kinds of things. So you do not need to go out and buy some plastic, but if you do, I encourage you to use the same trays year after year, wash them out, because we certainly don't need any more plastic in our waste stream. A cover is helpful. There's a clear plastic one in this picture, but you can also just use, a towel or some plastic wrap if you want. You don't necessarily need the cover, but it does help to hold in the moisture for germination. You need some kind of watering vessel that'll water your seeds. You can't just put them under the faucet because it will come out way too hard and splash your seeds and soil everywhere. Labels and markers help so that you can identify what is in each little cell and when you planted it, so you can monitor, how long it's been inside of that little seed starting tray. Liquid fertilizer, it's helpful to have on hand. It's not absolutely mandatory. I've grown seeds without adding extra fertility, and once they get into the ground, they usually recover. But if you do buy something, if you have a little bit of liquid fertilizer on hand, you can mix it right into the watering container and give it a little fertility. Usually I do about once a week, once they get that second set of leaves. Optional, but recommended is really to have a grow light. There's a picture one there. They're coming down in price now. And so they're not too expensive. And again, you can use them basically for the rest of your life. If you don't have a grow light, you will need a bright southern exposure window or door or something where you're going to get enough light. If you don't have that, your seeds or your seedlings are not going to be happy. They're going to kind of grow really tall and skinny, searching for light. And they may recover when they go outside, but you really do need to think about how much light you're giving them. A heat mat is helpful, but again, not mandatory. It just kind of brings the temperature of the soil up to about 60 degrees, which is, what the seeds like to start to germinate. So if you're in a basement that's particularly cold, the heat mat sometimes help, especially for things like peppers and basil, which seem to be a little bit more fussy about how warm the temperature of the soil is. But it's certainly not something you need right off the bat. If you get involved this year, you want to give it a try. And the next year you want to buy yourself a grow light and a heat mat, you can certainly add on. Just a little bit of language. So if you're looking through a seed catalog, there's lots of them to choose from. Or if you're in the store, you may see some of these terms, and I just wanted to give a quick definition. So an organic seed is one that's produced, the parent plant was grown using organic methods. So again, it's not necessarily required for organic gardening, but that's what that means. Open pollinated seeds versus F1 hybrids, you'll see seeds labeled as those. Open pollinated means that it's a pure strain that can actually pollinate itself and produce the same exact plant as a baby. So if you have a certain type of tomato that's open pollinated and you save a seed, you'll get the same exact type of tomato plant the year after. An F1 hybrid means that they've taken 2 different open pollinated plants and crossbred them in a lab or in the field to produce a particular style of plant. Oftentimes they're doing these breeding experiments for disease resistance or for appearance. So they may crossbreed to get some kind of cool color or some resistance to like a wilt or whatever disease. The important thing to know is that these hybrid plants, so say you have a hybrid tomato and you save the tomato and you want to plant those seeds next year, it'll grow into a tomato plant, but the fruit may be different because hybrids don't necessarily produce the same offspring year after year. So it's not important unless you're going to be saving your seed. It's just something to be aware of and do a little bit of research on. Heirloom plants, we see a lot of that these days, and that just means open pollinated plants that have been in existence for a very long time, and they possibly date back to some specific family or event. And they're oftentimes organic as well. GMO versus non-GMO, we hear a lot about that in the news. Most of the seeds that you're going to be buying from a seed catalog are of the non-GMO variety. You know, corn and soy are really where we get into GMO, and you're probably not buying bulk seed like that, and so it's usually not an issue if it's something that you want to pay attention to. Pelleted seed is an interesting thing. So there's a picture here. These are probably either lettuce or carrot seeds. Those are the 2 that most often come pelleted. They're very, very tiny, as you can see in this person's hand. Pelleted seeds is just an organic coating. I think it's like baking soda or something that they put on top of each seed, and it allows you just a little bit more dexterity. You can grab each seed individually. You can space them out a little bit more easily, where the teeny tiny seed is a little bit more difficult to work with. Pelleted seed's a little bit more expensive, but some people find it to be just so much easier to work with that they are willing to, you know, front that cost. All right, so I alluded to this before, which seeds to start indoors and which ones actually should be started directly outside. So there's tons of crops that should be started indoors, and this mostly has to do with the length of the growing season. So here in New Jersey, we have a growing season which lasts, you know, from the end of April until the middle of October approximately. If you were to plant a tomato or a pepper seed directly outside the end of May when it's not cold anymore, you probably wouldn't get very many tomatoes or peppers. So by planting them inside several weeks before and then using the plant, the actual transplant outside, you're going to increase the amount of food that you're able to get from your garden. So broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, all those listed on the left are things that I recommend starting outside. There's some that are kind of on the fence, like some people will start kale directly in their garden. You can, again, experiment. There's no hard rules in gardening. Onion way at the bottom is kind of in italics because you can start onions from seed. They take a very long time. You got to start them in like the beginning of February. But you can also buy onion plants, and you can buy onion sets, which basically look like teeny tiny onions. You can buy a big bag of them for pretty cheap from the garden center and use those. So those are kind of like seeds, but a different sort of thing. You don't have to start them inside. So at this point, it's too late to start onion seeds, but you do have some availability on how to plant onions. So some of the optional ones over here, you can go either way. As far as I'm concerned, if I could start something outside instead of babying it along in my basement for several weeks, I'll start it outside. So my summer and winter squash, beans, usually I start them all directly outside. Beets, lettuce, sometimes I'll start inside because I like to, you know, the spacing is very cute. If you're doing like a butterhead lettuce and you can get exact spacing on that, it looks very nice. But if you're doing like a loose leaf lettuce, you can just sprinkle that lettuce seed right on the soil and sort of like have this one big blanket of lettuce, which is really beautiful. Some of the ones on the bottom right, which I recommend to always direct seed, the carrots, radish, peas, arugula, and spinach. I have not had success transplanting any of these. Carrots and radish specifically because they're root crops. Their roots can get all mangly and weird if you disturb them. Peas, I usually plant so many peas that it just doesn't make any sense. I'll plant like an 8-foot row and you only have to plant them like 1 inch apart. So it just is so much easier to pop them directly in the ground. And arugula and spinach as well. They germinate pretty quickly. And I haven't had much luck transplanting those. But again, no hard rules. You can certainly bend these and play around in your own garden with what works for you. So when do I start them? And this is kind of the key question here, because if you start seeds too early, they'll become overgrown. They can get pot bound, which means their roots are kind of wrapping around themselves. I'm sure you guys have gone to garden centers and taken a baby plant out of the pot and seen all of those white roots kind of strangling it. You don't really want that to happen. On the bottom right there is a picture of what a good amount of roots would look like. You can see it's grown, the roots have grown all the way to the bottom of the container when they took it out, but they're not sort of strangling it. So I know in January, a lot of gardeners get super excited about starting their seeds. It's way too early at that point. Just kind of play around with your garden plans and your dreaming, but don't be starting any seeds. The majority of crops that you're gonna grow here in our zone are going to be planted about 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost, which is March 20th to 27th. Now, it's already April 20th. So a lot of people are probably panicking, thinking, oh my God, it's too late, I can't do anything. The only things on this list that I would say it might be too late to start indoors would be pepper and eggplant. Maybe tomato and basil, I'm on the fence with those. The rest of them, all those greens, they grow so fast. Really in about a month, you can place them outside. So you're not gonna be very far behind at all by starting them, you know, in the next few days or even in the next week. And you could certainly try out your tomato and basil. Pepper and eggplant are the slowest growing. They take the longest, I think, to kind of get to a point where you're transplanting them outside. So if you're just starting this year, I'd go ahead and just buy your pepper and eggplant transplants. But certainly go for it and try out the rest of them in little seed pots in your house. The family of cucurbits, which is basically the summer, all the squashes, so zucchinis and summer squashes, patty pans, winter squashes, which are pumpkins and delicata, butternut, the cucumbers and the melons, those are all cucurbits. They grow so fast that you really don't have to start them until 3 weeks before their plant out date, which is just about now, April 24th. You're gonna plant them out mid to late May. So even if you don't get them into a pot until May 1st, you still have plenty of time. Beans also fall into that category if you want to start them inside. You could also tuck beans right into the ground the end of May. Actually, any of those, the squash, cucumber, melon, and beans can go directly into the ground. So even though we're offering this class a tiny bit late for, you know, the ideal season, just because things were so confusing for a while, you still have plenty of time to get your garden started. Okay, so let's think about how to plant a seed. Now I'm going to demo this in just a few moments when I'm done with this PowerPoint. So you don't have to worry about it if it doesn't make sense to you. You're going to get your tray or whatever container it is that you're going to use. You're going to fill it with your soil. Here's an example of an organic seed starting mix. I love Coast of Maine products. So if you can find them, there's lots of other ones that are great quality. I choose not to use synthetic seed starting mix. So for instance, like a Miracle Grow, which has food or synthetic fertilizer in it, I choose to not use that. I don't think it's necessary and I don't like it associated with my garden. You know, I don't like planting it out into my garden. So that's up to you, but I would just share that information. You're going to fill the soil into the container. You're going to firm it down. So you don't want there to be a lot of airspace. I mean, you don't need to, like, you know, push it down with a bowling ball or anything, but really kind of press it into the corner so it's nice and firm. Otherwise, when you water it, it's going to sink down a lot. You're going to kind of make a little hole for your seed and plant your seed. Now, it's important to know that when planting your seeds, they only should be planted about the depth, the same depth as the size of the seed. And when I turn my video back on, I'll show you some examples of different seed sizes, because one of the major problems I think people have is planting their seed too deep. Most seeds are only going to be planted about 1/8 of an inch deep, like barely covered at all by the soil. And that's, you know, a lot of people, especially when I work with kids, they want to poke their finger in all the way to the bottom of the seed container and then plant the seed and cover it up with like 3 inches of soil. That is never, ever going to germinate. So be careful about the depth that you plant. You want to label it, because I promise you, you will not remember what it is that you put in the container. And that way, if you do 3 different kinds of peppers, you can remember which one is which. I usually put the date on the label as well, so I can remember. You want to give it a gentle water. Again, don't put it under the kitchen faucet because it'll just kind of push your seed deeper than it wants to be. So really gentle, and then cover it if you're going to cover it with any sort of covering. That's, again, it's kind of an optional step, but does speed things up just a tiny bit because it'll hold the moisture in for you. Until they sprout, each day you want to check on them, water gently each day if needed. Sometimes if there's a cover on them, it holds enough moisture that you don't need to water them, and you don't want to overwater them because that can cause some issues with rotting or with some algae growth. So don't overwater them. Just make sure the soil stays nicely moist. Okay, so once they sprout, depending on what kind of seed it is, it'll sprout at different rates. Like kale usually comes up in like 2 days, where peppers can sometimes take, you know, a week to 10 days to sprout. So don't give up on your seeds. Again, another reason to label the date so that you can check, because if something's been in the container for 2 weeks and it's still not sprouting, you might want to go ahead and replant it. So definitely keep some notes for yourself. Once you see the little green sprouts coming up, if you have a cover, you're going to take it off. If you have them on a heat mat, you're going to take your heat mat off or turn it off, and then you're going to put them in a lighted location. So you're either going to put them under your grow light, or you're going to put them in your south-facing window. So if you notice, up until the time they're germinating, you really don't need the light on. Now, if you have a couple of seeds that are sprouting before other seeds, that's when you take the cover off. You don't worry about it because you know, the other ones will sprout. You can put them under the light, and the remaining ones will sprout you know, in the next few days, hopefully. Seedlings need about 14 hours of light a day. So if you have a grow light, get yourself a timer, take your Christmas light timer, and set it up for about 14 hours. So mine turns on about 7 a.m. I think it turns off around 10 p.m., something like that. And so that you give them enough light. Also, you want to keep the grow light relatively low. It's not going to burn your plants. You want to keep it about 2 inches above the top. So when they first start emerging, your grow light is going to be really, really close to your seed starting trays, just about by 2 inches. And then as they grow, you can raise that light up. Most grow lights that you purchase from the store will come with a stand that has an adjustable light height, so you can raise it up and down. So check on that before you invest. That's ideal if you can do that. Again, you're going to water your plants once a day. Don't overwater, don't underwater. Some people use a fan for circulation, so that can help because it gives your plants a little bit stronger roots because they're kind of being blown around. It may make for easier transplanting outside. It's not required, but it is something to think about. So if you have an old fan hanging around in your basement, you might want to set it up over your seed starting area. All right, Kathy hasn't interrupted me yet, so I'm guessing there's no major questions at this point. Kathy, was there anything you wanted to ask?
Okay, so we only had a couple. One, something you said earlier was that everybody would get a copy of the presentation. So the answer to that is yes. Folks might have joined a little late and missed that, but everybody will get a copy afterwards. One question about using fish tank water for fertilizer when you're amending your seedlings.
Sure, that's very interesting actually, because I do have a fish. And when my daughter cleans her fish tank out, I do use that water out in my garden. I'll definitely pour it on my plants, or I'll pour it into my compost because, as you guys know, fish fertilizer is very high in nutrients. I think you could probably use it on your seedling starts. The only thing I'd be worried about is the smell. I try not to use fish fertilizer indoors because it's really disgustingly smelly. So think about it's going to be sitting there and kind of drying and maybe fermenting in your house. So I would definitely use it outside, but maybe not inside.
What about diluting it?
You could dilute it, yeah. And that's exactly the slide that we're on now. So once you start fertilizing, you are going to use half strength of your fertilizer. So you could dilute it. You could try it. Just be wary of if it smells, then maybe stop using it.
Okay. So a question about how does the fan help? The question is with transplanting, but I think you just want to go back and focus on how it helps with the seeds growing and preventing, at least in my case, moss building up on the soil.
Using the fan. Yeah, the fan just adds some circulation, so it does. You may have to water a little bit or be careful about, making sure they don't dry out. But stagnant water can be a problem because it can grow algae. So that's one thing to be aware of. If that's a problem, putting a fan on is going to help. So if you see algae starting to grow, that's a solution for it. But the fan also, some people say that the plants will develop stronger stems. Especially tall ones, like this picture is tomatoes. So because they have to, they're being moved around and the fan is blowing them, their stems are going to be a little bit more sturdy. So when they move outside, they're going to be a little bit better prepared for the different weather. So that's one thing to keep in mind.
Another one about water. Would you recommend watering from the bottom or the top?
I have never watered from the bottom. I always get that question. I don't own enough like trays to put my starts in to water them from the bottom. I also would worry that at some point your roots of your plants are going to reach the bottom of your seed starting trays. And I don't think it's healthy for them to sit in water. So if you are going to water from the bottom, first of all, when you first start your seeds, you can't water them from the bottom because there won't be enough like capillary action to get the top all the way moist. So you need to water from above when you first start them. Once they have a couple weeks of growth on them, you could switch to bottom watering, but I would be careful not to let them sit in the water. Maybe fill it, let them sit there for 15 minutes and then take them out, because you do not want the roots of your plants to be sitting in stagnant water. That's not a healthy environment. So that would be my answer to that.
Okay, and then a question about harvesting seeds from fresh vegetables, but you might want to just mention that at the end as seed saving.
Yeah, okay, that sounds good. All right, so we'll move on. So fertilizing, again, I mentioned at the beginning. So if you look at this picture, the very rounded heart-shaped leaves, those are the cotyledons, and the leaves that are the second leaves to emerge, which really are called the first true leaves, those usually are the shape of the mature plant. So you'll see your tomato, the second leaves that come out of your tomato plant look like a tomato plant or kale or whatever it is. When you start seeing those second leaves, that's when I would start thinking about fertilizing. So what I usually do is I use liquid kelp, but you could use, there's other, there's actually fertilizers made for seedlings. So use about half strength, so like a little droplet into my tiny watering can. I usually do it once a week. Like I'll say like every Friday I'm gonna fertilize. And I do it when I water them. So it's my watering for that week. And it does help them. You'll notice if you don't fertilize them, they may start turning a little bit yellow or purplish, which means they're looking for fertility, or they may just be a little bit stunted. But usually when you plant them outside, they recover from that anyway. So if you happen to not have a fertilizer on hand, or if you haven't used it in the past, it's just something to keep in mind. Let's talk about some possible problems. So what happens? My seed didn't sprout at all. I've got this container, nothing came up. Your seeds may be old. If you go buy seeds from, say, Walmart, nothing against Walmart, but who knows how long those seeds have been sitting there. Seeds planted too deep is one I mentioned. Not enough water, they will not germinate if they're too dry, and too much water, they will rot. And if it's too cold, so if you put if you're trying to germinate stuff outside when it's 40 degrees, they are never going to germinate because they don't have enough temperature to break that dormancy. Damping off is a problem, usually coming from too much moisture, again, from plants sitting in kind of soggy conditions. And this is what you'll see. They'll be growing fine, and all of a sudden they'll just kind of like melt. And that's just from too much moisture. There's no recovering from it. Take it out. I would empty the container of soil. I would wash it out with like vinegar or bleach to make sure, because damping off is, I think it's bacterial. And then start again. And live and learn. Nothing to worry about there. Tall and lanky just means you don't have enough light on your plant, whether it's your grow light is too high or you're in a window that is not getting enough sun. Usually, like I said, they can recover as soon as you move them outside, but that's exactly what that's telling you. No amount of fertilizer is going to fix that problem. And then here's the algae we were talking about. If you see this, this is a pretty bad case scenario, but the plants seem to be okay. You can put a fan on and see if it helps. You can actually scrape off some of that algae from the top of the surface and see if your plants recover, then you're fine. If they die, then just replant them. But the fan will help with that type of algae bloom usually. So transplanting to a larger container in general, anything that's sitting in your house for more than a month, I usually plant into a larger container. So tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, and basil usually takes about 2 months before they are ready to go outside. So after about a month, I take them out of their little starter container and put them into a larger container, give them some fresh soil and let them keep growing. The kales, broccolis, all those green stuff, usually they only need about a month inside, so I don't bother transplanting them. I just take the tiny plant and pop it right into the garden and then let it do its growing from there. The least amount of work I have to do inside, the better. When do you plant into the garden? So it's important to understand the difference between cool season crops and warm season crops. Cool season crops do not mind a little bit of frost at night. They may mind it if it gets down to 25, but they're not going to mind it in the 30s or certainly in the 40s. The warm season crops will hate you. They will die, or they will sulk, or they will not produce as much fruit for you. Definitely not worth it. So your cool season crops, you can plant outside, whether it's by seed or by transplant, about 2 to 4 weeks before the last frost, which we remember was May 15th. So April 15th to 30th. Now it's April 20th right now. I still think the ground is too cold for planting outside. I've planted a few things and they're just kind of sitting there. They're not doing much. So give yourself some time. I think April 30th is fine. These are things like mostly greens, right? That can go outside and transplant at that point. The other things that you can direct seed that are cool season crops are root crops. So carrots, radishes, beets, parsnips, those type of things. Those we recommend direct seeding, but at the same time, 2 to 4 weeks before the last frost. The warm season crops are the things from, the Mediterranean crops, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, the melons, the beans. These things do not want it to be cold outside. So you're going to start them inside, you're going to keep them inside until well after the frost. So some people will say Mother's Day, other people will say Memorial Day. It's up to you, keeping in mind, watch the weather. And if it looks like it's going to dip into the 30s, even if just down to 35, I would not put these guys outside or cover them with a blanket or something if you've already put them outside. Before you transplant stuff to the outdoors, it's in your nice warmish basement or dining room or wherever you have your plants growing. And you need to harden them off before you put them outside. So that means slowly introduce them to the real world. So the wind and the sun is much stronger than the grow light in your basement or even a window. So this hardening off usually takes about a week. And what you're going to do is you're going to bring your trays outside and you're going to let them have a little bit of time outside. And then you're going to bring them back in. You're going to next day bring them out a little bit longer. And you're basically going to work them up to a full day outside in the wind. And then you can go ahead and transplant them. And even then, when you transplant, it's recommended to do it kind of on a not so sunny, hot day, maybe in the evening, because if you transplant them, it is a level of shock. And you don't want your plant from that transplant. So plant them when it's kind of shady, maybe give them a little bit of cover for a day or two. If it's going to be a humongous thunderstorm, maybe wait a day or two before planting them outside so that they're not so stressed. And then once they're out there, after a few days, they're usually pretty well adjusted and they should be fine. So that's what I have for my PowerPoint. So I'm going to take a quick 1 minute and actually move my computer to my seed starting area, and then I will turn my video on and do a little demo. So give me just 1 minute. All right. Can everybody see me? Kathy, can you see me? Are we good?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Just as a reminder, that way you can see the best that you can. Make sure your video in your top right corner is on speaker view, not gallery view, so that you can see the demonstration that I'm about to do. Okay, I'm going to do 2 quick demos for you. We're in my garage now, so welcome. I'm going to try to aim my camera so you can see well enough. I'm going to first do a seed starting demo to show you what that looks like, and then I'll do a little bit of a transplanting demo so you can see that as well. I wanted to, I don't know how well this is going to show up on the video, but I did glue some seeds. I think mostly you see the glue, unfortunately. When I talked about how deep to plant seeds, and you only plant them as deep as they are, this right here is a lettuce seed. Can you see the tiny white dot in the middle of that glue? That's a lettuce seed. Here, this one's almost invisible, is a kale seed. It's a tiny little circle, almost the size of a lettuce seed. This is a pepper seed, so a little bit bigger. This is a zucchini seed. So obviously the zucchini seed is going to go a lot deeper into the soil than the other guys. These guys are barely going to be buried. And in fact, lettuce seeds, which actually like the light to germinate, you can actually sprinkle them right on top of the soil and not cover them at all. Just be aware that when you do that and then you go to water, they don't get knocked out of place. Here's the plastic container I'm going to use for my seed starting. This is called a 6-cell pack. You can buy really long ones that hold up to 50 or 70 different little containers, but whatever. I mean, this is probably one that I bought that I reuse every single year. You should wash them out between, but of course I didn't this time. I have some seed starting mix in here. I don't remember what kind it is, but it was probably that Mother Earth or one of those related. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to fill my seed starting container. I'll show you what that looks like. I usually try to pre-moisten my seed starting mix. Sometimes when you get it out of the bag, it's so dry. If you blow on it, it's like a dust bowl. If you've ever tried to water something like that, it's really resistant to watering. It almost is like hydrophobic. So I usually put it in a container like this and add a bunch of water and then kind of swish it up with my hands. It'll accept probably like a gallon or 2 of water for a whole bag. And that way it's nice and moist, kind of like a chocolate cake. And then when I fill my containers, it's already pretty moist and I only have to give it a little bit of supplemental water. So I filled my soil or my seed starting mix in here. I'm gonna go ahead and press it down, like I said, into the corners, along the edges, so that I have no air spaces here or very little air space. You've got like, sometimes there's like sticks and things in here, you can just get rid of them. Now at this point, the level has gone down a little bit, if you can see that. So I'm gonna actually add just a little bit more soil to the top to make sure they're even. Do the same thing, press it down in here. Okay, so now I'm all filled, I'm ready to start my seeds. I'm going to do this zucchini. This is what I mean about variety when you buy your seeds. Like, look at that, it's so cute. This little tiny round zucchini. I cannot wait to see what this looks like. My kids are dreading it because they hate zucchini, but it's a great time of year to start your zucchinis, your winter squashes, your cucumbers. It's actually, in the next week or so would be a good time. Again, here are my seeds. They're very, very large. So what I'm going to do is I take my finger. I'm always very dirty when I'm seed starting, and I put a little kind of like impression into each little section before I plant. Now, if this was kale, that tiny little seed, I would just kind of drop it in and cover it up really gently with, like I said, about 1/8 of an inch of soil. Since these seeds are so big, let's see if I can kind of get this on camera. All right, I'm gonna plant it in here in the little hole. Let me back it up. And I'm actually gonna bury it just, again, as deep as it is, as deep as the seed is wide. And then I'm just gonna give it a little bit of cover on top of it. So you're not going all the way to the bottom. You just wanna make sure that the seed has enough energy to kind of pop up above that soil level. So I'm gonna plant, I usually plant, so there's a question like, do I plant 1 or 2 in each cell? It depends. If I know these are brand new fresh seeds and I'm pretty confident that they're all going to germinate, I'll just do one. If I have a ton of seeds, then I might do two in each hole. But then if they both germinate, you need to answer yourself the question, do I kill the one or do I separate them? That's always a big question on people's minds. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. So I'm going to cover these zucchini seeds up gently. Now I'm going to water them. So I have this tiny little watering can that I use with a little tiny spout. I think this is really easy just to use a watering, the water bottle and just water the top. So you want to be really gentle with watering them so that the seeds don't get pushed all the way to the bottom. So you want to give them a nice amount of water so that they're nice and moist all the way to the bottom. When I start my seeds, usually I'll check back like later that day, make sure, because the soil will absorb a lot of water. So if it looks like it needs a little bit more, I might give it a little more later in the day. You don't have to water till it's dripping out the bottom though. That would be a little bit too much. All right, so now I'm gonna do a label. So you can use anything for a label, but I have these plastic things that have been laying around for years and years. I like to use industrial strength Sharpie because the labeling lasts a long time. And especially if something's going to be growing for 2 months, if you use pencil, it might wear off. So I'm going to put the name, and then I'm going to put the date, which today is 4/22. If they're all 6 the same, I'm just going to put one label in there. I'm not going to worry about labeling them all. But if they were all different, you could go ahead and put 6 different labels. If I were going to cover it, now is when I would cover it, whether it's, putting a towel over the top, putting that plastic little dome over the top, or just even a piece of plastic wrap. You could take this, if you have a heat mat, now is when you would put it on the heat mat, and then you would kind of walk away and be done with it. Check each day, give it a little bit of water. Once it germinates, you're going to take it off the heat mat, and you're going to put it under the light. So grow light or into your window. These guys should germinate in just a few days. Zucchini come up pretty quickly, and then I will be good to go. They only take a couple weeks, about 3 weeks inside before I plant them outside. Okay, I'm going to show you these guys. So these are tomatoes, mostly tomatoes. Here's some other stuff growing in here, some lettuce, some pepper, some fennel. These guys have been growing since March 20th. So they're just a little over a month old. I can get the angle right here. Things like tomato, which are not going to go outside for another month, I like to pot up or transplant up. And so I'm going to show you quickly how to do that. I have a larger container. Some people, like I said, will use like a yogurt container or what's it called? A solo cup. Whatever you have on hand is fine. I'm going to fill it up. I'm going to show you how to do this with a tomato because that's the most interesting. Most transplants, you're going to fill the container, put a hole, or maybe fill it, not all the way, pop the plant out, put it in the transplant container right at the same level that it's growing in your seed starting tray. Tomatoes, however, are unique because they actually can grow roots right along their stems. So you can actually plant them really deep. So I'm going to show you how you do this. Here's this is a tray, right? This is the seed starting container. You just kind of give it a pinch and loosen it up because you don't want to tug too hard on the stem. You want to lift it out really gently. And this is what it looks like. So you can see it's got roots all the way to the bottom, but it's not root bound at all. If it didn't have roots all the way to the bottom, half of the soil would have fallen off and I would know this is not really ready to be transplanted. Usually after about a month, they're ready, especially tomatoes. Now, there's 2 tomato plants in here. So I have to decide, do I want to tease them apart or do I want to get rid of the one? This is called seedling side. So I'm going to actually get rid of one of them. I'm going to pinch it off right here. I'm not going to pull it because I don't want to disturb the roots. For a tomato plant, like I said, it's going to grow roots all the way out of its stem. So I actually, when I transplant them, I plant them right up to this level where those little cotyledons are growing out, and it's going to make for a nice, strong tomato plant. So I've only filled this container up a little bit, halfway, put that tomato plant nice and deep in there. And then I'm gonna add some soil all around the side of it. You wanna be gentle because you don't want to damage the stem. You don't wanna damage the roots. So I'm kind of pressing soil all around. Okay, so this you can see now is planted right up to the level of the cotyledon. Now I'll say again, if I were doing pepper or eggplant or basil, I would not do that. Or kale. Kale, you can go a little bit deep. Tomato is really the only one that likes to go really deep like that. And then it's gonna grow a lot stronger. So this guy now has nice fresh soil. At this point, if you had a seed starting mix that had fertility in it, that would give it another extra boost. And I'm gonna leave this under my grow light. I'm gonna put a label in it reminding myself what kind of tomato it is. I'll leave it under my grow light for another month. It's gonna be huge by that point. And then I'm gonna plant it out in my garden. I'm gonna give this guy a little bit of water. And that's pretty much all there is to it. I don't have any, I'm not gonna do a demo of planting outside, of transplanting outside, because it's a little too cold and I don't know how I do that with my computer. Okay, so that's it. It's 10:58. So Kathy, are there any quick questions I can answer before we release people?
Yes, so a couple of questions about preventing the deer from getting to your garden. One person mentioned they had a 4-foot fence, which probably isn't tall enough.
Deer can jump over anything. They can jump over 6 feet. So an 8-foot fence is the only thing that's considered deer proof. That being said, I had a 4-foot fence in my yard that deer never jumped into because it was a small garden. It was pretty crowded in there and there was lots of other things in my yard that the deer could be eating. So for about 3 years I had that before I put a larger fence in my yard and it was no problem. So it's definitely worth a try using a 4-foot fence, being aware that, you know, a deer could jump that height easily.
One question about the mix that you were using when you were doing the repotting. Are you still using seed starting mix or are you using a potting soil?
Good question. Usually I use the same stuff, but there is a mix, you could buy mixes called transplant mix. Usually the difference is the transplant mix usually has some fertility in it, but the seed starting mix sometimes has that as well. And you can also use liquid fertilizer. So it doesn't really matter. I usually use the same stuff. I buy 1 bag or 2 bags of the same stuff at the beginning of the season and just use that.
Okay, a person saved some Meyer lemon seeds and would like to plant them. Any suggestions?
You can plant them and they'll germinate, but I don't think you'll ever get a tree. Most fruit trees are done by grafting. They're not true to the seed growing. So as I mentioned before about hybrids, you won't get the right fruit. So if you want a lemon tree that produces lemons, I would just go ahead and buy the grafted tree from a nursery. But I have heard people plant lemon seeds they smell really good, the leaves. So you could try it.
Can you suggest some vegetables that can be grown indoors since I live in an apartment?
Okay, that's a great question. So if you want to grow them indoors 100% and never move them out to a garden, 2 things are critical. Number 1 is the amount of light that you have. I would say you definitely would have to get a grow light or have a greenhouse window or something where you're going to get a lot of light. Number 2, it has to be something that doesn't need pollination. So all of your fruit crops, your tomatoes, your peppers, your eggplants, they need to be pollinated in order to get a fruit. So you need to focus on stuff like kale or broccoli or lettuce or all the herbs that don't need to be pollinated. Pollination produces a fruit or a seeded, I know we think it's a tomato or fruit, but a tomato is a fruit because it has seeds in it. That's how you tell if something needs pollination. There are self-pollinating fruit plants like tomatoes that can self-pollinate. So you can try that out. And I've heard people that are somewhat successful. And there's also these really cool indoor growing contraptions like, I forget what they're called, Grow Tower. There's another one, I forget, that, you know, these huge towers that you can use. They're like hydroponic grow systems that you can put in your house and grow food year round. And if you have self-pollinating stuff like tomatoes, peppers, or stuff like kale and lettuce that don't need pollination, you can grow a whole variety of food. Do we have one or two more questions, Kathy, before we close out?
Yeah, we probably have 5 or 6 more. So if you want to just do a couple and then do the rest via email.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay, so when is the best time to start strawberries indoors, or is it best to start directly outside?
I've never actually grown a strawberry from seed, though I
Yeah.
have seen the seeds for sale. I've only ever grown strawberry by runners. So I'll go to the garden center, or you can go online and buy yourself a pack of usually 25 strawberry runners. They'll be delivered to your house, or you can buy them, and then you plant them directly outside. Usually like the beginning of May. They're a little bit frost hardy, but again, transplanting them, I wouldn't do it when it's super cold. But I've never done them from seed.
Any steps to do when seedlings grow thin and weak and tall?
You just have to give them more light. That's the only solution.
Yeah.
If it's warm enough outside during the day, I might put them outside. Even if you had something to cover them with, like maybe like a clear plastic container, you could make like a mini greenhouse just to get them more light. But really what you want to do is get them into the garden as soon as possible. So as soon as you're able to transplant them outside, plant them a little bit deep, especially the tomatoes, broccoli and kale can go a little deep. That gives them a little bit more stability, and then they'll kind of catch up when they get the outdoor sunlight.
All right, and it looks like you might actually be able to finish. This is 2 questions in one. What soil do you use outside in a raised garden bed? And should we wait on hardening off with the wind and cold temperatures, or can we do it slowly on nicer days?
Okay, so hardening off, you're only hardening off at this point your cold hardy plants.
Yeah.
And it takes about a week to harden up, right? So if I wanted to plant something next week, I would start today. So I do have some stuff outside right now. I have some bok choy. I think there's some kale and some lettuces in a tray that I've been moving in and outside. I think it's outside right now, or I'd show it to you. And so, yeah, you could do that. If, like yesterday when the storms rolled through, I pulled it back into my garage. I didn't want to get them damaged. I bring them in at night still. But eventually I will leave them out all night. So you can start that. If it's very windy, I wouldn't do it because it'll dry them out and it might damage them. So baby them a little bit. And then your warm season stuff, you're not going to start that process until maybe around May 10th. That would be the earliest to start hardening them off. And last question is the soil that I use in my raised garden beds. Here in Somerset County, we have really heavy clay soil. So people automatically think that's no good for growing a garden, but clay soils are actually extraordinarily high in nutrients. And some soil scientists will argue that it's the key to soil nutrient health is the clay component. And I could do a whole 2-hour lecture on soil health, but basically what I would do was I would mark out the area for my raised bed. If it's in a lawn area or if it's just in a dirt area, I would dig that area first. I know some seed starting or some garden people will lay down weed fabric and just pour stuff on top. I do not do that, nor do I recommend it, because I think the soil that we have here is incredibly beneficial to your plants. So I usually take a shovel. You can use a tiller if it's your first time breaking up an area, or a broad fork or something. I turn the whole area over, including the sod. I just did it because I dug a new garden bed last week. Dig down a foot, flip it over, and do that whole garden area. Then, if you're using a wooden frame, you could put your wooden frame in that spot. You don't have to use a wooden frame. Then what I would do was, now your level is already raised because it's fluffed up a little bit just from flipping it over. I would buy some high quality topsoil, perhaps that was mixed with compost, or topsoil and then purchase a bag of high quality compost or used compost that you have in your house. For a new garden, I would use about a 50-50, so 50% compost to topsoil mix. But you don't need as much soil as you think because you've already flipped all this stuff over and you've kind of fluffed up your area. If you have sod in there, I would wait about 2 weeks before planting anything because you want it to break down before you plant anything into there. So do it, if you did it this week, in about 2 weeks, you'd be ready to plant. But I think, there's a lot of if you Google or you look on YouTube for building a raised bed, they're always like buying a million bags of soil and just pouring them in there. And I just think it's not necessary. Use what you have and then top it off with some topsoil and some compost to the level that you want it to be. Year after year, you're going to add just a little bit more compost, 1 to 2 inches each year. You don't need to add, like, keep that 50% again. Okay, we're going to stop there. It's 11:07. I apologize for keeping you a little late, but thank you so much for joining me. I really enjoyed it, though I wish I could have interacted a little bit more. As I said, you'll get copies of the questions and copies of the PDF, along with a question about if you have suggestions for more classes that you'd like to see. And I wish you all good luck in starting your gardens and your seeds, and I hope to meet you all in person at some point. Have a great day.